Okay, so far in this chapter when we've looked at quadratic functions, we've looked at two different ways that we could write them. There was this general form ax squared plus bx plus c. And then there was this standard or vertex form that we looked at last week, which was the a times x minus h squared plus k. In this form here, h and k were my vertex. Okay? There's a third form. This is a factored form. So the factored form is f of x equals x minus m times x minus n times a. So we're going to look at the characteristics of m and n in this equation, or in this section. So we're going to use a graphing calculator, and you guys are going to graph these equations. You're going to look for the x-intercepts, the y-intercepts, and the axis of symmetry. Let's look at this first question. If we look at this first equation, y equals x minus 2 times x minus 8. The value of m, so this is supposed to be written as x minus m. So m would be 2. What would n be? 8. So then we go to graph this. So y equals, clear whatever graph you have in there, x minus 2, x minus 8. Could probably try it on a standard window setting, so that we'd be pressing zoom and standard, which is choice number 6. Maybe not.
Is this correct? I got this.
Yep. So when I graph this on my calculator, I get this parabola shape that opens up like this. I want to find the zeros. That's what I look for to find these x-intercepts. So second, calc, choice number 2. And then I have to be on the left side of this 0. So depending where you are on this one, the left side is up here, the right side is down here. If I'm looking at this one, this becomes the left and that becomes the right. So if you look here, it gives you what your x value is right now. Mine's at 0, and I know I have to be more than 0 to get to this point. So I hit my cursor until I can see the cursor on the screen. That's the left side. Cross the x-axis, and now I'm on the right side. I don't want it to guess. I press enter one more time, and then it says 0, and then it gives me the coordinates. 2 and 0. So that's one of them. 2 and 0.
Whoa.
To get the other one, same thing. Only this time I need to be over here. So I scroll my cursor over. Again. So this becomes my left bound, because that's the left side. Now I'm on the right side, press enter one more time, and I get 8 and 0. So I don't want you thinking that the left side always means to be above the x-axis and the right side means to be below, because it's not that case. The left side means being on the left side of the x-intercept. The right side being right side of the x-intercept. So I get 8 and 0. Okay? The y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. Can I see where this has crossed the y-axis? No, I'm not high enough. So I need to adjust my window settings. So instead of going up to 10, maybe I go up to 20. And then graph it again.
Only your y though, right?
Only the y. Now I can see it crosses the y-axis. What do we know about the value of x along this line? What are my coordinates? 0. The x is equal to 0. So this time I can press the trace button and 0, x equals 0, and then press enter, and what do I get?
2. Y equals 16.
Y equals 16. So the y-intercept is 0 and 16. So this is 0, and this is a value where you let x equal 0. And then we have the axis of symmetry. What is the axis of symmetry? This is my graph. Where's the axis of symmetry?
Would it be like the 2 and 16?
Go back through and find it in your notes, please. So the axis of symmetry is this vertical line that cuts through the middle of the graph. The axis of symmetry cuts through the vertex. How do I find the vertex of the graph?
Would you use intersect?
Nope.
The minimum and
Minimum or
maximum.
maximum?
Minimum or max? So which one is it, min or max?
Minimum. For this
Min.
one, because it opens up.
Because this opens up. So find the minimum of the graph. So second, calc, min.
Do we have to fix our window section?
No, you shouldn't have to, because I can somewhat see. But again, I have to be on the left side of the vertex and then the right side of the vertex. So I went from the left side to the right side, press enter one more time, and I get 5 and looks like negative 9.9 or something like that. 5 and negative 10.
Mine's like graphing really weird now.
So 5 and negative 10. So my axis of symmetry would be that x equals 5. Next one. X plus 2 and x minus 6. So the x minus 6, there's my n. What is my m? Negative 2. Good. So the same thing. Go through and repeat the pattern. Find the x-intercepts, find the y-intercept, and then find the vertex. And look to see if you see any patterns between the equation and the columns that you're filling in. Okay, so you guys are going to help me fill in this chart now. If I have x minus 2 times x plus 2 times x minus 6, there's my graph. So adjust my window settings so I can see where it crosses. So what are my two x-intercepts?
2 and 0 and 8 and 0.
This row right here.
Oh, negative 2 and 0 and 6 and 0.
Okay. What is the y-intercept? Where does it cross the y-axis?
0 and negative 12.
And what is the axis of symmetry?
2.
Okay, so it has to be x equals 2. Okay?
So the first side.
If I look at y equals x plus 2 and x plus 6, where are my two zeros? Where are my two x-intercepts? Yeah.
Negative 2 and 0 and negative 6 and 0.
Okay, so negative 2 and negative 6. What were my m and my n values?
Negative 2 and negative 6.
Okay, what is my y-intercept?
0 and 12.
0 and 12. Okay. And what is the equation of the axis of symmetry?
For the third one, negative 4.
Okay. Then x times x minus 4. Y equals x times x minus 4 graph. Where are my x-intercepts?
0 and 0, and then 4 and 0.
Okay, what are my values of m and n?
0 and 4.
What's my y-intercept?
0 and 0.
Okay, and what is my equation of my axis of symmetry?
2.
Okay, so then the last one, x plus 8 times x minus 10. What are my two values, my m and my n?
Negative 8 and positive.
Negative 8 and,
Positive 2.
okay. What are my zeros? Where's across the x-axis?
Negative 8 and 0.
And?
Negative 8 and 0 again. Oh.
What is my y-intercept? Where does it cross the y-axis?
It was like, on mine it's showing like negative 8 and then like a 0, but the 8 is like really, it's like bolder than the 0, so I'm not sure if that means something.
Got 0 and negative 80.
For the y-intercept?
Yep.
Oh.
Because when you look at the 2 in the equation, with the plus 8 and with the negative 8 and the 10, when you multiply them together, that gives you your y-intercept.
Yep. So what's my axis of symmetry?
1.
X equals 1?
That's what I got.
Okay, so using these equations, could you fill this chart in without actually graphing it?
Yes.
Okay, so how do I find my x-intercepts?
You use the m and the n.
Okay, so the x-intercept was the m and n values. What about the y-intercept?
You multiply m and n together.
Multiply them. And the axis of symmetry.
Would be m plus n divided by 2.
Perfect. So the axis of symmetry is add them together and divide it by 2. So if you do that, then you'll be able to find all of your parameters from your factored form. So I am going to give you question number 1 to answer. Or actually, no, sorry, we're not done that part. What I'm going to give you actually for homework is I want you to do investigation number 2 on the next page. So this is virtually, it's very similar to the first one. You have the m and the n, only now we have a values. Finding the x-intercepts, finding the y-intercepts the same way as before, and then telling me if it opens up and down. And then finding the parameters of that, and that's where we will pick up. Okay?
Do you want us to do this right now?
May I?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so I gave you guys the task of completing this investigation and filling in the chart. So we're going to go through what the values are on the chart. So if we start off with our first equation, y equals 2 times x minus 5 times x minus 2. My a value is 2. M is 5 and n is 2. The x-intercepts of the graph are 5 and 0 and 2 and 0. The y-intercept this time is 20. And the graph opens up. Okay? So the next graph, A is 4, M is -3, N is 2. Intercepts, we're at -3 and 0, 2 and 0. The y-intercept is -24, and this one also opens up. For the third row, we've got 5, 10, and -3. 10 and 0 and -3 and 0 are my x-intercepts. My y-intercept is -150. This opens up. For the next row, A is -3. M is 0 because it's just the x. N is -2. So my x-intercepts are 0 and 0, and negative 2 and 0. My y-intercept is 0, and this one opens down. Then we've got the fifth row where a is negative 10, m is negative 1, and n is 3. So I get negative 1 and 0 and 3 and 0 for x-intercepts. My y-intercept ends up being a positive 30. This one also opens upside down. And in the last one, m is negative 1. I get a positive 10 and a negative 10, so my intercepts are 10 and 0 and negative 10 and 0. My y-intercept is positive 100, so that would have taken some adjusting on your window settings. And this opens upside down as well. So what we're looking for is we're looking for a pattern between the equation and the x and y intercepts and the shape. So what these a and m and n values do to the graph as opposed to having to graph it all the time, because when I do get into things like having a y-intercept of negative 150, that takes a lot more time on my calculator to graph, and it can be a little bit more time-consuming or stressing to try to find that intercept. So the patterns, hopefully, that we notice is that the x-intercepts match up to the value of m and n. The y-intercept, these numbers here, is the product of these. So I can write it as AMN, which is the same as A times M times N. We typically don't like using these multiplication signs because when we deal with letters, they start to look like X's. So the other way we could do this is we could use brackets to show that we're multiplying all of these. When my A value was positive, the graph opened up. So the shape was like this, and when the A was negative, it opened down, and it had a shape like that. Excuse me. So we can take this information and combine it with the information from before. When I have a graph in the form of y equals A times x minus m times x minus n, the following observations can be made. The x-intercepts will always be m and n. The y-intercept will be multiplying these three numbers together. The axis of symmetry, add them and divide by 2. So add the m and the n and divide it by 2. If A is positive, the graph opens up, which means it has a min. If it's negative, it opens down. It means it has a max. So in class example number 1, you are challenged to state the x-intercepts, the y-intercepts, the equation of the axis of symmetry, and the direction of the opening of the graph without actually graphing, based on the characteristics and the patterns that we've discovered. So in this graph, my A value is 1, my M would be negative 4, my N would be 10. So my x-intercepts are negative 4 and 10. My y-intercept is multiplying the three numbers together, so negative 40. The axis of symmetry is x equals, so to find the axis of symmetry, you have to add these two numbers together and divide by 2. So negative 4 plus 10 divided by 2, this is 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then the direction of the opening, because A is positive, this opens up. So what I want you to do is pause for a moment and see if you can do B and C, and then when you're ready, you can press play and continue on. Okay, so if we look at B, again, we're going to list off. A is negative 2, M is negative 6, N is negative 9. So my x-intercepts will be negative 6 and negative 9. My y-intercept be to multiply these three numbers together, which will give me negative 108. The equation of the axis of symmetry would be x equals negative 6 plus negative 9 divided by 2, which is negative 15, so negative 7.5. And this is going to open down. For C, my A value is negative 1, M is 0, and N is 20. So my x-intercepts are 0 and 20. My y-intercept is 0 because when I multiply them all together I get 0. The axis of symmetry is 0 plus 20 divided by 2, which gives me 10. And that's an x equals 10 because it's supposed to be an equation. And this is going to open down because of this negative value. Okay? So question here is graph these two equations on your graphing calculator. So let's take out our graphing calculator. And let's put both of these equations in there. So our first equation is 2 times x minus 3 times x. Oh, forgot the bracket here. There we go. Times x minus 7. And then the next equation is negative 2 times x minus 3 times x minus 7. I'm going to go into my window settings. My x min and my x max should be good because I know my intercepts are at 3 and 7. My y's I want to be careful of because when I multiply these three numbers together, I get 42. So my y max has to be a lot larger of a number. So I'm going to go up to 50. And then my scale, I'm going to make my scale tens. So I went from negative 10 to positive 10 going up by ones, negative 20 to positive 50 going up by tens. Press the graph button. There we go. So there's my first graph, and there's my second graph, because I forgot, if this is negative 2, I should be at negative, let's fix that. I should go down to negative 50, because I'd have a negative 42. So there's my first graph, and there's my second graph. So what do you notice about the two graphs? You notice that this graph here, oh, I totally messed that up. Let's fix that equation. Because that equation should be 3 minus x. There we go. Okay, now if I graph them. And when we go to graph this, I'm actually going to change the thickness of my line so that I can see the two graphs being drawn. So there's my y1, and there's my y2. There we go. So now what do we notice about the two graphs? They are the same. So why are they the same when the a value is negative in the second equation? Well, that has to do with this right here. The way that the equation is supposed to be written is it is supposed to be x minus m and x minus n. So if I did that right here, I would get negative 2 times negative x plus 3 times x minus 7. But we don't have a negative x value. In our equation, it's supposed to be a positive x. So to get rid of, or to fix this negative x problem, I'm going to factor out a negative 1. If I take out a negative 1, I get a positive x. Take out a negative 1, I get a negative 3. Now, when I multiply these two numbers together, instead of a negative 2, I now get my positive 2, x minus 3, x minus 7. So we call it a disguised a value because even though the a looks negative from the original equation, when I actually fix things to make sure I'm writing in descending order or I'm putting that x value before the constant, it actually ends up bringing out another negative. So if we look at class example number 2, it says write each function in this form and then find the x and the y intercepts. So if you're asked to find the x and the y intercepts without using a graphing calculator, you want to make sure that you're in this form. So on A, that would mean if I just take this and rewrite it in the negative x plus 1, so the negative stays with the x, there's no sign in front of the 1, which means it's positive. Then I can factor out my negative 1. And this becomes my new equation, y equals. So that means that my x-intercepts will be 1 and 10. And then my y-intercept would be multiplying the three numbers together. So 10 times 1 is 10 times negative 1. And I would get negative 10 for a y-intercept. So the challenge on B, to pause it, go through the steps and see if you can write it in this form and then state the x and the y intercepts. When you're done and you're ready, you can continue on and see what we've got for an answer. So with this one, again, I'm going to rewrite it. Then I'm going to factor out my negative 1 to get x minus 4. And then I have to take out another negative 1 to get my x minus 12. If I multiply these a values together, I will end up with a negative 3 x minus 4 times x minus 12. So my x-intercepts would be 4 and 12. My y-intercept would be 4 times 12 times 3, which would be 144 negative because of this negative 3. Okay. In class example number 3, the idea is to match the equation with the graph without using a calculator. So if we look at these 4 graphs, we look at our equations. So this equation is the way that we like to see it. This one is, but this one isn't. So let's fix this equation first of all. The 1 plus x is the same as the x plus 1. Then I've got this negative x plus 4, which means I'm going to take out a negative 1, move it out in front, and I get an x minus 4. Now everything is written the way that it should be. A is negative, so this one's going to open down. This one's going to open up, opens up, and opens down. My my x-intercepts in this equation are 1 and negative 4. So let's look at the graphs to see where I get x-intercepts of a positive 1 and a negative 4. Well, I had a positive 1 and a negative 4 on D, a positive 1 and a negative 4 on C. This one opens up, so this one has to be graph D. For this one, my x-intercepts are negative 1 and 4. So negative 1 and 4 is A and B. But this opens down, so this must be graph B. Equation number 3, my x-intercepts, -1 and 4. So -1 and 4 again is A or B, but it opens up, so this becomes graph A. So this must be graph C, which opens down, intercepts of 1 and -4. Okay? Okay, so in the next section, we look at determining the equation when given a graph. So you're given a picture, can you determine the equation from the picture? So it's a matter of going through and looking at what my possible A and X and M values are. So remember, my M values are the intercepts. So the x-intercepts are 3 and 6. So that would be the values of M. M equals 3, N equals 6. So if I put that into the equation, what I get is that y equals A times x minus 3 times x minus 6. Now I need to solve for that A. So the way to solve for the A is you look for another point on the graph that we haven't used yet. So we've used this one, and we've used this one. Is there another point on the graph that is marked that we can use? The y-intercept. So we can use the y-intercept and put that into this equation. My y-intercept is 0 and 36. So I let y be equal to 36, and I let x be equal to 0. So I get 0 minus 3 and 0 minus 6. So in here I'm going to get -3 times -6, which will give me a positive 18. That'll then be multiplied by A. So to figure out the value of A, divide both sides by 18, and A would equal 2. So then my equation becomes y equals 2 times x minus 3 times x minus 6. To find the vertex, that's this point right here. So there's two ways I could find the vertex. I could graph this equation at this point, find the minimum value, and find the vertex. The other way that I could do this is if we go back, one of the other things that we learned with this type of an equation is I can determine that equation of the axis of symmetry. And the axis of symmetry goes through the vertex. So if I can figure out the axis of symmetry, I can use that to help find my vertex. So to find the x value, add these two together, 3 plus 6, and divide by 2. So 3 plus 6 gives me 9, divided by 2 gives me 4.5. If you were doing this on your calculator, you need to put brackets around the 3 and the 6. So now I put that into this equation. Y equals 2 times 4.5 minus 3 times 4.5 minus 6. When I put that into my calculator, I get a value of -4.5. So then my vertex, this point right here, is 4.5 units to the right and -4.5 units, so 4.5 units down. If I know the vertex, I can put it in this equation where h is my vertex, so minus 4.5 squared. K is this value, minus 4.5, and the A value is the same. So there becomes my equation for a graph in standard form. Okay, we have one final question. Determine the coordinates of the vertex of the graph of the quadratic function if it passes through the following points. So if we were to do a quick sketch, this is going to pass through the points. I've got negative 8 and 0. I've got 2 and 0. And then I've got 0 and 48. So how am I going to connect these 3 points to draw my quadratic? There's no possible way for me to draw it this way. It has to be drawn upside down. And it is useful to know that, because if this has to be drawn upside down, it means my A value is going to be negative. So I know my M is negative 8. I know my N is 2. So I can start off with y equals A times x minus the negative 8, so it becomes x plus 8, and x minus 2. To find that A value, I use this point, this 0 and 48. So y equals 48 when x equals 0. So I have 48 equals negative 16a. So a equals negative 3. Okay, so that gives me part of the equation, or that gives me the equation. Negative 3 times x plus 8 times x minus 2. At this point, I could then graph this and then find the vertex using my maximum. Or I could do what I did on the last question with the equation of the axis of symmetry. So if I find the axis of symmetry, I would take negative 8 plus 2, which is negative 6, divide that by 2, and I get negative 3, equals x. So I put negative 3 into this equation. Negative 3 plus 8 times negative 3 minus 2. So this is 5, negative 5, and I get negative 75. So then my vertex is negative 3 and negative 75. Okay, so your practice questions, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8.